A very warm welcome to the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. My name is Philip Murphy, I'm the director of the Institute. I'd like to thank the Overseas Service Pension Association very warmly for suggesting this idea. This is the first of two witness seminars. The second will be on the 29th of September, and it will have its theme Aid, Trade and Development. I'd like to thank in particular David Breton for raising this with me and for putting in a lot of work behind the scenes to make these two events happen. I wanted to start really with a brief overview of the subject and some possible questions that we might want to discuss. But I'm very nervous about doing this in a room full of such distinguished constitutional experts. And I don't know whether any of you have ever watched the comedy quiz show on television, QI, hosted by Stephen Fry, but there's one contestant, Alan Davis, whose sole function on it is to articulate common misconceptions about any subject under discussion. And at the very least, you might find some of my naive comments on the Westminster Model, things that you can throw bricks at over the course of the rest of the day. We use this shorthand term, Westminster Model, but it goes without saying that while there's a fairly strong family resemblance across the systems of representative government in the Commonwealth, no former colony which received its independence in the post-war period inherited an exact replica of the British system. And when one thinks of the essential features of that system, it isn't difficult to see why. They would include, I think, the following: an unwritten constitution, parliamentary supremacy, a system governed by a series of constitutional conventions, a unitary state, although of course more complicated in recent years by the existence of regional assemblies, the separation of the head of state from the head of government, a two-chamber legislature, and the independence of the judiciary, and a well-developed system of political parties in which the parties regularly alternate in power. So clearly we don't have this. Andrew Harding talks of, instead of an export model of a Westminster-style system. The chief difference being between that of the UK, that whereas the UK has parliamentary sovereignty, the export model puts in its place constitutional supremacy, with most Commonwealth constitutions having special procedures for their own amendment. Of Commonwealth countries, only New Zealand follows the UK in having an unwritten constitution. As William Dale has pointed out, following the model of the Irish Free State Constitution of 1937, the drafters of post-war constitutions, quote, tended to set down the conventions in their constitutions in the form of rules. They thus reproduced a fully working Westminster model, but as law. And the corollary of the notion of constitutional supremacy is, of course, that the courts assume the power of the constitutional review of legislation. While some former British territories have been able to operate as unitary states, in other cases the federal system seemed appropriate, either because of the highly artificial nature of colonial boundaries, or because the states seemed too small to be viable as independents. And these federal systems, of course, suffered a variety of different fates. The Malaysian Federation has survived relatively peacefully, although not without significant changes in its nature and extent. The Nigerian Federation, as we know, collapsed into civil war and has undergone major revisions since independence, and a number of federations in the late colonial period, like those in Central Africa, West Indies, and Southern Arabia, didn't even survive into the era of independence. Other differences, of course, only a minority of Commonwealth states retain a two-chamber system. But I think to appreciate the variety of deviations from the classic Westminster model, if you like, one only needs to focus on the issue of the executive. One can identify at least 5 broad sets of arrangements in the Commonwealth constitutions for the position of head of state. We have constitutional monarchies under the sovereignty of the Queen, represented by a Governor-General. We have constitutional monarchies under local rulers, as in the case in Malaysia, for example. We have a president separate from the head of government. We have a president who exercises executive powers, and in a small minority of cases, like Brunei and Swaziland, a traditional ruler who exercises executive powers. And within those presidential systems, there's a further division between directly and indirectly elected presidents. One of the most striking constitutional developments in Africa in the 1960s was a move away from constitutional monarchy to executive presidents, led initially, of course, by Nkrumah with his referendum in Ghana in 1960, but then perhaps paradoxically by the British government itself, which in the case, for example, of Kenya or Malawi, actually puts pressure on those governments before independence to move straight to republics. Other problems in terms of the adoption of this Westminster-style system. One, of course, was the assumption that a multi-party system would almost inevitably materialise out of thin air. Whereas one of the problems, of course, is that in the late colonial period, in very few cases did one have a multi-party system of any sort up and running. And in some cases, that the adoption of that Westminster-style system could be accused of having helped to create elective dictatorships of one-party states. Another problem was the lack of restraints within civil society on the power of the executive, things like a free press, powerful interest groups, and a prosperous and well-educated middle class. Another of the problems, perhaps, is that the Westminster system in itself actually fails to provide very effective formal guarantees to the independence of the judiciary. So one has a number of problems, a number of paradoxes here. And I think Harding puts it very nicely. He says one can argue convincingly on the basis of numerous instances, both that the Westminster model has been a spectacular failure, and that is proved remarkably durable. Both propositions contain truth. So I think we're left, when we consider this, and when we listen to your recollections of your personal experience, with a number of broad questions or sets of questions. And I really have 7 very quickly. One, to what extent was the Westminster model customised through detailed local negotiations, which provided for local arrangements which suited the territories involved? Secondly, what alternatives to the Westminster model appear to be available? We'll see, I think, later on, in the case of the Solomon Islands, that the colonial authorities initially rejected the Westminster model in favour of a governing council based partly on the local government system of Jersey. Yet this system only ran for 4 years, from 1970, before being rejected in favour of something to a Westminster-style government. Thirdly, and following on from that, was the success of the Westminster model largely due to the fact that it was, in effect, the default position for constitution makers? As Paul Moore has put it, quote, Westminster succeeds not because of its internal virtues, which are sometimes arbitrary, or its appropriateness to local conditions, which may not matter. It succeeds because it was there first. How far is this true? Fourthly, to what extent was there a gradual development of constitutional systems. What we would call in the social sciences, these constitutions being path-dependent. Each earlier constitution shaping the next one. So that when one gets to independence, the broad shape of the constitution is almost already a given. Fifthly, and this is more in the way of speculation, why was it that the Westminster system manages to take root in some territories, India, Jamaica, but not in others? Why more broadly does it seem to bed down in the Caribbean and parts of the Pacific, but not in tropical Africa? Sixthly, did constitution makers on independence give enough thought to the nature of executive power? We all know that in the period leading up to independence, the fiercest battles were often about the nature of the franchise. Or in the case of Nigeria, say about what form the federal system would take. Was the issue of executive power thought about sufficiently clearly and carefully in the years running up to independence? And finally, something that may not feature in sort of our standard sort of constitutional discussions, the question of the army. One could say that in terms of the evolution of the Westminster system from the time of the Bill of Rights of 1689, one of the striking features has been a distrust of standing armies in times of peace. Yet the designation of Commander-in-Chief given to Governor-Generals and some presidents of independence seem to assume the existence of permanent standing armies. Given the vulnerability of many former colonial territories to military coups, should not more attention have been given to the role and nature of the security forces as part of the broader sense of a constitutional settlement on independence? Those are some very broad thoughts. I am sure individual chairs will have other ideas that they would like to explore.